What drives a child back into detention? Is it contempt of court? Is it truancy? Is it failure to follow and obey with the court laws, right, with the court obligations? So you need to consider how many different ways can a judge decide whether or not a child will be pulled out of their home, will be placed in detention, will have their risk factors increase based on the fact that we're not treating these children as if they were children, right? Maybe some of you might remember a time where you got into a fight in school and you had to spend, time in detention. You were given more school. Now you get an assault charge. Now you get disorderly conduct. Now you get a fine. Now you get community service. And every single time you don't do what is expected, you get more community service. And now we're looking at the fines. Who pays those fines? The parents or the child? The parents. So now we're also putting more responsibilities and burdens on families that are already struggling. So again, considering what happens. Now this particular young man, he had usually done pretty well in school, but by the time that he was done, he had dropped out. So then we also have a 5-year-old was sent home in a police officer's vehicle for wearing the wrong color shoes. This was a dress code violation. And the school wanted to make an example. They wanted to teach this child a lesson. Now, you also need to keep in context that the dress code called for black shoes, but the mother couldn't afford it. So what she did is she took a black marker and colored in those white sneakers. Okay? What was the interaction between that child and that officer? This was a misuse of the law enforcement's time, right? Which is why we also have to consider our educators in the room right now. What meetings will you be having with educators and administrators in schools by the time that we're done today, right? They need to understand the implications of their actions and how this increases risk factors for these children. A 12-year-old suspended for 3 days because her jeans were too tight. Now, really framing this as a Title IX violation, framing this within our work, within the lens of our field and understanding rape culture. What is this teaching young girls about their bodies? That they have to be policed, that they are the distraction, that they are the ones that should have been more cautious about what they were wearing. Because if they're disrespected, well, what did they expect? The jeans were too tight. This child went back to school and the mother had to take time off of work, that every morning with a different pair of pants, and she was still sent home. By the time that she was done with this experience, she just ended up going to school in sweatpants. Right? But again, whose education is more valuable? Whose education is being prioritized? And what is the messaging that's being sent? Now this uniquely impacts our young women of color, but in a very specific way, our young black girls in our community. Raise your hand if you have read Push Out by Monique Morris. It is on your resource list, and if you haven't, I encourage you to get the book. I did provide you with all of the list of resources that I've been talking about today, but please read her book. It's phenomenal. But she talks about the fact that black girls are getting the message that no one wants them there in school more than other girls. They're very clearly being labeled as loud, defiant, obnoxious. They're given these labels day in and day out. But now let's go ahead and look at how they're also being policed in terms of what they look like. This was a 7 and a 12-year-old girl who was threatened with suspension and expulsion because of their hair. The 7-year-old was sent home because of her dreadlocks. They said that it was a distraction to school. The 12-year-old with her natural afro was said that it was a distraction to their classroom environment and was threatened with expulsion unless she got it under control. What does that say about cultural erasure? Is that violent? Yes. Yes. Right? So again, it's something as simple as a dress code policy, but we see how violent it in fact it really is. And how this uniquely impacts LGBTQ students, especially gender non-conforming girls. They have up to 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment than their straight counterparts, based on a study published in the Medical Journal of Pediatrics. There was a CDC report that was released last year that showed that LGBTQ students have 66% higher likelihood of experiencing violence. These individuals existing at these margins and these intersections are desperately in need of advocacy. Title IX could protect them, but are we advocating for them? Are we litigating? Are we encouraging individuals to know how to file these complaints? Because they deserve to exist in a school where they are safe, where they are respected, where their humanity is fully seen. So now let's transition to law enforcement in schools. And I know that I'm going fast, but again, I only have 20 minutes, so I'm trying to get all of the information into you as much as I can. Now, this is a very controversial subject because, again, where we currently stand, but it has historically been a disconnect for communities of color who have felt historically traumatized in the way that law enforcement has engaged. So how are we within our own movement building bridges, engaging in education initiatives with law enforcement so that they understand that there is critical need for change? But you remember Spring Valley High, raise your hand if you remember this incident. If you haven't or if you didn't, please go ahead and YouTube it. I don't have time to show you the video, but it is incredibly violent to see the way that this young woman's body is thrown across the room. And now there was a lot of national conversation around this, but what there wasn't enough conversation around is what was happening in the background. Look at what I highlighted. What is that child doing? Covering their face. Because it's not just the trauma that is being imposed on the body of the individual who was thrown, but it's also trauma that is now being created for the individuals that are witnessing. And trauma is something that is not just individually experienced, but they can be secondary survivors, they can be bystanders, right? And so what we're seeing here is that exposure to traumatic experiences has the potential to alter children's brains, which cause longer-term effects in areas such as attachment, physical health, emotional regulation, cognitive ability, low self-esteem, behavioral control, and aggression. And I know that there's a lot of rhetoric around, what is, or a lot of conversations about, how bad law enforcement is doing, but we also need to see that they have the potential to do good work. There is an individual that we were working with in my community where there was a child who, he was called in to respond. He was becoming very aggressive, very defiant, wouldn't listen. All of a sudden, he throws his books, he throws the pencil, he kicks the chair. They clear the classroom. So you can just imagine how this is escalating quickly. So law enforcement steps inside. And this individual is telling them, calm down, telling them very, very, very calmly, calm down. And the child is saying no, and he continues to be riled up and angry. And then all of a sudden, the child lays on the ground and says, I'm not going anywhere. And he crosses his arms. And what do you think law enforcement does? Law enforcement, this particular school resource officer, goes and a few feet away from him, lays down where he's laying. I get really teary. And he says, I'm not going anywhere either until you're ready to talk. And so, after about 20 minutes, this child has calmed down. He releases his arms from being crossed across his chest. And he says, my dad got arrested last night. And he saw daddy beating mommy, and then cops coming and dragging dad away. And he was angry. But that could have escalated into something so awful, they could have gone hands-on. And he did it. And that child is now so closely attached to that officer because he said he needed a mentor, he needed a friend, he needed someone that wouldn't just treat him the way everyone else was treating him. But we see that these children have trauma. So I'm showing you a film, and this is from the film Resilience.
We all like to think of childhood as this time of joy and innocence. But, for many of us, it's just not true.
When you grew up in these type of situations, it's not something you talk about. I know I did it.
The first thing that we found is that adverse childhood experiences are common.
Kids are young, they don't know what's going on, they won't remember anyway. Well, the child may not remember, but the body remembers.
There was this incredible gene whiz effect. You mean adverse childhood experiences cause heart disease and lung disease and liver and cancer?
Exposure to trauma affects children's developing brains. The impact is on your behavior, it's on your heart, it's on your DNA. Like, how do you deal with all that?
Don't reach out claims to them.
We have a whole new body of knowledge now that could open up what we have up till now been seen as intractable and solvable problems.
No child should be punched or kicked. No child should be punched or kicked.
If you can get the science into the hands of the general population, they will invent very wise actions.
Do you feel like any of the interventions have been making a difference?
They made all the difference in the world.
It's there, it's possible, and a defeatist attitude is completely disconnected from what 21st century science is telling us. And we should be going after that like a bear.
I will encourage you to host a film screening of that in your community for people to really start engaging about the way that this uniquely impacts children who have been exposed to trauma, because we need to engage with them differently. They're not angry, they're traumatized. They're not defiant, they're hurting. It is a cry for help. So this is also a phenomenal article, and I encourage you to send it out and distribute it to any of your law enforcement partners. But it says, when officers lack the training or tools to effectively de-escalate police youth encounters, they can rely upon only what they do have, adult-based techniques. But youth are not little adults, and they act and react very differently. The effect of using verbal and physical control techniques designed for use on adults upon youth is like throwing gasoline on fire. Pain escalates with anger and aggression because the youth brain relies more upon parts that respond emotionally with triggers of fight or flight reaction. Currently, our officers, they are in post and they receive training on how to engage with adults. They do not have the training equipped to be able to work with children. Right? So when they're trying to tell them, calm down, that strategy doesn't quite work. Their child's brain is different. Right? And so what I encourage people to do is, again, learn the science, understand the data, and see how this is going to uniquely inform our work so that we are pushing against the current practices. Because currently, children with disabilities, some of our most vulnerable children in our community, 70% of them who exist in detention centers have some form of cognitive or physical disability. And they have a 200% higher likelihood of being adjudicated on charges. They're not being screened for competency. Recently, I've been pushing for so many competency inquiries on my children, and a good 80% of them are being found that they are not competent to stand trial. So we're just throwing on these charges. They don't even understand and comprehend what's happening. Right? So how about this story? Sheriff's deputy shackled elementary school students ages 8 and 9 who had disabilities for throwing a tantrum. Then we have legal restraints. This is the story of Carson Luke, who was throwing a tantrum based on his disabilities. This is violations of IDEA and 504. But this child was brought into a classroom, and they were trying to put him into a screen room, and they slammed the door, and it crushed the hands on his fingers, the fingers on his hand. And I wish that I could tell you that that's uncommon, but according to the ProPublica Health Report, there are 267,000 incidents like this across America. Mental institutions no longer use these types of restraints. Health institutions no longer use these types of restraints. These restraints are not illegal in schools. Does that surprise you? Yes. Some know, some yes. So as we do this work, we have to understand that there are unique implications for children with disabilities. Now, the one that I feel is most indicative of oppression is the racial and ethnic disparities that we see within the pipeline. Studies show that students of color are more likely than their white peers to be suspended, expelled, or arrested for the same kind of conduct at school, right? So it's not that they're worse students, it's not that they're misbehaving more often, it's literally that they're being treated differently. And the consequences are dire. We have an entire generation of disempowered youth who are existing behind cells and thinking that that in fact is the rest of their narrative. And we have to encourage them to believe otherwise. And the dropout impacts are, I think, one of the ones that are linked to poverty, substance abuse, criminal delinquency, adult incarceration, all of the things that we're trying to push against. Dropout impacts that greatly, right? So we need to make sure that children understand that education is in fact a key to their success, a key to their future, and that's something that they can obtain. But children who fail to finish high school are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested as an adult. Those who drop out of school are more than 8 times more likely to go to prison than students who graduate. And that's also shared by the fact that there's 77% of inmates in prison today who dropped out of high school. Right? So I wanted to just make sure that before I finished up and wrapped up on this conversation, you saw what this looks like in your own community. So I did a little bit of research, and the FTP in Massachusetts. Black students in Massachusetts schools are almost 4 times more likely than white Latino students are 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended, often for minor offenses. Students of color are more likely to be disciplined for subjective offenses such as defiance, disrespect, or dress code violations. Those are all incredibly ambiguous. Anyone can describe them, define them in their own way, and they're being disproportionately defined for students of color in a way that would suspend them or expel them. School discipline and educational disparities mirror a stark reality of the criminal justice system. Only 7% of Massachusetts residents are Black, yet 28% of the people behind bars in Massachusetts are Black. Right? So yes.
Can I just add something for immigrants of color, because when they come from immigrant families or the immigrants themselves, the added part to the school to prison pipeline is the school to prison to deportation pipeline.
Yes.
And later, for minor offenses, they will get deported more likely.
Absolutely. How many of you have watched the film 13? Okay, excellent. And that is also one of those things that even when people might be like, well, how is that prevention education, right? You need to be prepared. Yes, I'm sorry. So she was talking about the school to prison pipeline and the school to prison deportation pipeline, because we see a lot of the children that are being adjudicated on these charges. These children are also now being flagged by ICE. There's a lot of work I'm doing in my own community about being able to streamline another way for children to be treated, but deportation very much is in fact a risk factor for these young individuals. So why is this a topic that rape prevention educators must address? Because it's all connected, and this was a report that came out from the Center for Disease Control, Connecting the Dots. I encourage you to read it. But gang violence is connected to bullying, it's connected to school violence, it's connected to intimate partner violence, which is connected to child abuse, it's connected to elder abuse. It is all connected. And this is part of what we were talking about this morning, particularly as Commissioner Burrell mentioned, working across the spectrum, doing prevention beyond the individual, doing beyond individual work in schools, but literally talking about our relationships, building community around it, engaging societal factors. Because if you're teaching a child that sexual violence is wrong, but then a child discloses to an administrator that their behind was grabbed in school and nothing is done, then what you're telling them is contradicting what they are seeing as normalized and justified. If those two things conflict in a child's mind, they're going to go with the one that is being, they're being upheld by who? People of power, right? So you need to also consider, if we're teaching the students in school, are we also teaching the administrators? Are we also teaching the educators? Are we also teaching the individuals that are engaging with these children daily? And when we talk about the school to prison pipeline and sexual assault, children across any given night in America, 10,000 of them are held in adult facilities. And although they make only 1% of the population in those facilities, they account for 16% of the sexual assaults reported. Right? They're immensely vulnerable to being perpetrated against in these spaces. And when we talk about the socialization that happens in these spaces, you're talking about engaging them and teaching about consent, teaching about normalization of sexual violence, rape culture. They're going into these spaces, and it's survival of the fittest in those spaces. I have low offending youth with high offending youth. One of my clients was in there for a first offense, and he was being held in the same facility as someone who was being charged with aggravated robbery, another who was being charged with attempted homicide, right? How is this child being socialized on another? Right? We have to also consider what is our work in being able to reduce violence in those spaces. And when we talk about marginalized and invisible, the school to prison pipeline conversation has disproportionately focused on our young men and failed to really take into account our young girls and the fact that many of these girls entering the system have experienced some form of trauma. I had a client, when I was reading the probation report, she had been in front of this judge 3 or 4 other times, and I'm reading through the history, and something is not making sense to me, because I'm watching her, I've spent time with her, and I'm reading this report, and so in my meeting with her, I say, I have to be honest, I'm looking through the history, and something about this doesn't make sense. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I know it's going to be hard, but I need you to be honest if possible. Did something happen? And I gave her the time frame. Because it was after that, and all of a sudden we saw the drinking, the not coming home, the drug use, the delinquency behavior skyrocket. After speaking with her for a few minutes, this young lady, tears just streaming down her face, discloses that she was gang raped. No one had asked her, not probation, not intake, not anyone who had been working, not school, not parents, not judge. No one asked her the critical question as to why did this start? When did this start? How did this start? But it was all based and led from trauma. Right? So we also have to understand that our young girls, for many of these adolescent females, there appears to be a link between the experience of abuse and neglect, the lack of appropriate treatment, and the behaviors that led to that arrest. And for the children who are involved in foster care, we have individuals that are literally being primed for trafficking, for homelessness, for delinquency, for substance abuse, for dropping out of high school. Children in foster care, only 50% of them ever graduate high school. Only 24% of them will go on to a 4-year college institution. Most of them, I think it's, God, I wish I had that number right now, sorry about that, but I wanted to show this. Being in foster care was the perfect training. This is the story that came out of the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline Report. If you haven't read it, please do. It's from the Human Rights Watch and the MISS Foundation. Being in foster care was the perfect training for commercial sexual exploitation. I was used to being moved without warning, without any say, not knowing where I was going, whether I was allowed to pack my clothes. After years in foster care, I didn't think anyone would want to take care of me unless they were paid. So when my pimp expected me to make money to support the family, it made sense to me. Right? Does that break your heart? That they are literally being primed? Right? And there's this really interesting book that talks about pimp tactics. And this individual shares how he could walk by a young lady and look at her. And if he looks at her and says, "Ma, you have real pretty eyes." And she looks down at her feet and shuffles her feet and just says, "No, I'm not," or "No, I don't," he says, "That's my victim." But if he walks by and says to this girl, "Ma, you have real pretty eyes," and she says, "Thank you," he keeps walking. Right? Why? Because there's a difference between those that they can see are broken and hurting and those that he can see are going to fight back and challenge that. We need to infuse our prevention education with empowerment, to make sure that we are talking about work, to make sure we are talking about pride, to make sure that we are pushing back against this empowered generation mentality that they have, where young girls think the only power they have is between their legs. And I know that sounds crude and crass, but let's just be real. That's all they see. Right? If you saw misrepresentation, then you know the numbers in terms of how you see little girls when they're 5 years old, they want to grow up to be the president. And by the time that they're in middle school and high school, they stop thinking that they can be that. Right? So I'm speaking to all our community, to our advocates. Please, let's talk about reframing the work that we're doing. So tying it all together, let's go ahead and talk about how important it is to take back our schools to empower our upcoming generations. I encourage you to watch this film, Paper Tigers. It talks about the behavior isn't the kid. The behavior is a symptom of what's going on in their life. We hosted a screening of this in our community. And also resilience, and also precious knowledge. If you haven't watched the film, it talks about education from a cultural standpoint. It talks about being able to equip children from a framework of empowerment, of knowing their worth, where they came from, their roots, who they are. And then we see that there are better alternatives. Restorative justice is a different way to approach conflict or difficult behavior. When we're talking about students' disciplines, traditionally we ask, what was the rule? Who broke it? What is the punishment? But with restorative justice, we're instead asking, what happened? Who was affected or harmed? And what needs to be done to repair the harm and keep it from happening again? We are not pushing our children out. We are bringing them in. We are rallying around these children with restorative justice practices. That can also be a part of prevention work, helping them, equipping them to being able to know how to facilitate restorative justice circles within their own schools, their own environments. This doesn't just have to be schools. Engage faith leaders in being able to have this as part of their curriculum, their teaching, right? Who is missing at our table? So there is light in math. Individual school districts have turned toward restorative justice measures, which are designed to enfranchise youth instead of zero tolerance policies and suspensions. And thanks so much to Deborah and Deanna for sending me this article. According to the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, which is a program that was started by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, from 2007 until 2015, Massachusetts recorded a 55% overall drop in the number of kids being held in detention. That is huge. That is great. We are so happy to see that. However, we still have work to do. Why? Because the racial disparity still exists. White youth decreased at a much faster rate than the average at 69%. Black youth were about on average, and Hispanic youth decreased by only 26%. So now we currently have Hispanic youth making up the largest portion of our detention system. And when we talk about, again, the school to prison pipeline to the deportation pipeline, a lot of these children do not speak English. And a lot of these children are actually having their educational rights violated because some of these institutions don't have translators. So what they are given a package that has English to Spanish and they are told to translate it. No one is communicating with them. Right now, I'm currently working with the detention centers in our community because I said, wait a minute, what do you mean to tell me that the schools come in and they're not engaging these children? These children are telling me that their peers who speak a little bit more English than them are translating for them. Is that an issue? Is that a violation of their educational access? Yes, right? And that's not just for Latino youth, that's also for our refugee youth who are in there, who don't understand the system, don't understand the laws. So your role is getting involved, becoming invested, and learning your school policies, including know your rights dialogues in your presentation so that children know how to be critical thinkers and how to start pushing back against these individuals who are telling them you have no rights. Discuss policy change with administrators and legislators. Focus prevention efforts in juvenile detention centers. Empower youth and develop youth leadership. Advocate for an inclusive dialogue on trauma for young men, women, and gender nonconforming adolescents. Know the research and reports that give credibility to the intersections and help capture their story and see them. This is a project from Humans of New York. It says, who's influenced you the most in your life? He says, my principal, Ms. Lopez. How has she influenced you? When we get in trouble, she doesn't suspend us. She calls us to her office and explains to us how society was built down around us. And she tells us that each time somebody fails out of school, a new jail cell gets built. And one time she made every student stand up, one at a time, and she told each one of us that we matter. What would it look like if we are able to literally speak life over these children every single time we engage with them? What would it look like if we help them in their minds break the chains of mediocrity, of poverty, of failure that they have seen generationally? What would it look like if our programs could take on that model? One of the things that I'm currently working on is I'm a keynote speaker and facilitator for a 2-day training in Mississippi next week. And I'm creating a presentation that talks about prevention work from Mississippi Freedom School mind frame, right? How many of you know Mississippi Freedom Schools? Okay, could you imagine what it would look like? Could you imagine what it would look like if we would engage our youth in a way where they are civic engaged youth, where they are challenging, instead of just regurgitating the data, they are actually speaking about it, and thinking about it in a critical way, right? What would it look like? So potential partnerships to consider is the NAACP, ACLU, Public Policy Practicum at local law schools. Engage, I should tell you this because I was formerly a law student, we do work for free. Put us to work, right? If you think that there is research that needs to be done, if there are things that you have questions about, engage the Public Policy Practicum. They will do it for you. Boys and Girls Club, Racial Justice Coalitions, Peer Court and Diversion Programs, local activist groups against police use of force, police departments, community policing, and SROs. Now, if there are laws that you are interested particularly in looking at models that could be brought here to your community, HBSTPP 460 was a law that I helped pass with Representative Collins, the ACLU, and community activists that specifically required memorandum of understanding for school resource officers and administrators so that they knew what their role was, they knew what they couldn't do, and they knew that they needed training to work with children of color, children with disabilities, and those that existed in the intersection. But the one that I'm most excited about is the one that just passed this legislative session. HB 239 is an overhaul of the juvenile justice system. No longer can children be sent to a juvenile judge or the court system if they get a class C misdemeanor, right? No longer are they getting fines that are extremely absurd, like 300 community service hours for their first offense. They are all capped at 36 hours for each episode, which means if you have 5 allegations that happen on the same day, you can't get 36 hours for this allegation, for that allegation, only 36 hours for the one entire episode. That is huge because I have kids right now who are trying to work off 700 community service hours, and they are in these programs for years, right? So this is an incredibly exciting change that we're seeing in our community, so I encourage you to read up on it. It was led by the Pew Research, and it's 150 pages. Have fun. So here is my call to action, and this is really what I get excited about, is being able to engage you in a community to say, how do we move forward? Because it's not enough for you to be compassionate. It's not enough that you're heartbroken, that you touched your heart and say, oh my gosh, that's so awful. I feel so bad for these children. You have to act. You have to be willing to put it into action. So is it the children in detention center that are disempowered and disengaged and needing you to desperately advocate for them? Is that what is your calling? Is that what calls or pulls your heartstrings? Is it the children who see violence every single day in their homes, and when they come into school, they can't focus? So they're angry and they're disengaged and they get pushed out instead of being wrapped around in services they desperately need. Are they the ones that are calling to you? Or is it the children who are homeless and who are being perpetrated against and are immensely vulnerable because of the fact that they are living on these intersections of vulnerability? Is that what is calling to you? Whatever it is that is calling to you, I simply ask that you remember that you can make that difference, that you can now move forward with your initiatives and your programming to consider that we can make that change. Every good law or case that you studied was once a dream. Every good law or case that you studied was dismissed as impossible or impractical for decades before it was ever enacted. Give your creative thoughts free rein, for it is only in the hearts and dreams of people seeking a better world that true social justice has a chance. And it always seems impossible until it's done. And of course, I want to just end with this quote, which says, change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. And when I say we, I'm specifically talking to every single one of you. You are the ones that we have been waiting for. So go back into your communities, do the work that these children desperately need for you to do. Advocate, be bold, be bright, and just know that we are making a difference.
workshops, but I just want to run a couple of quick logistics. One, at the registration table, you all receive a name tag.
So we have this caricature here where you have drop the handgun punk, and it's the principal with their zero tolerance policy missiles, right? And so you can laugh at it, but unfortunately this was actually a satirical representation of a real story where a child was suspended for 3 days because he had a handgun. Him and his friend were playing, and he was going pow pow. 3 days of suspension. Was that an overreaction? Now hear me, I don't minimize gun violence in America. It is something that we should be worried about when our babies are coming into schools, armed with weapons. But when we push children out and refuse to give them access to an opportunity of safety, an opportunity of engaging in pro-social activity, then that's concerning. So zero tolerance policies are a fundamental component of the pipeline because they lead to suspensions, expulsions, and sometimes arrests for minor misbehavior that in some cases does not pose a school safety concern. These policies fail to take into account the harm and severity of the misbehavior. And more importantly, they create a greater gap between services, counselors, and resources that could potentially have increased the child's protective factors. So the spectrum of suspendable infractions is wide. You have things where you have an assault on an employee to an individual who's suspended because they had blue hair, right? So I ask you now, does the punishment fit the crime? A Texas boy, here's a quick story, suspended for saying that he could make classmate disappear with Lord of the Rings sorcery. The father wrote, I assure you, the medical powers necessary to threaten his friend's existence. The boy's father later wrote in an email, but if he did, I'm sure he'd bring him right back. So that's cute and we all laugh about it, but the fact of the matter is this child was suspended.